Welcome to Peters Township Public Library's historical stroll through Center Church Cemetery. I'm Nancy Martin, the library archivist, and I will be your tour guide. Thank you to Sam Cushy and Peg Rowe of the Center Cemetery Association for permission to do this tour and for all of their support while undertaking the research to complete it. Today, as we stroll through the cemetery, we'll be talking about the history of the church, the cemetery itself, some of the iconography or artwork on the gravestones, and of course, the lives of the people that are buried here. Unfortunately, I won't be able to talk about every family that's represented in Center Church Cemetery, and that's because there simply isn't enough time. I will also be restricting myself to the two upper older portions of the cemetery, and that's because I think it's true that after a few generations, there's no one left alive to remember people who are buried in a cemetery, and that by visiting these older portions, we're able to bring these people back to life, if only for a few minutes. Before we get started on the cemetery itself, I'd like to talk about the history of the church. Permission to establish Center Church was granted by the Presbytery of Ohio on April 16, 1828. The first church building was a one-room structure, 40 feet by 50 feet, built at a cost of $1,200. It opened its doors on Tuesday, January 5th, 1830. And this plaque marks the location of the southeast corner of the church. According to the Reverend Alexander Blaine Brown Jr., who wrote a highly entertaining history of the church in a little booklet in celebration of the church's 100th anniversary in 1928, the church was called Center, quote, because the location chosen for it is equidistant from Chartiers, Bethel, Mingo, and Bethany congregations, and not because, quote, we regard ourselves the center of the earth, nor of the community. I enjoy the Reverend Blaine Brown very much. Also included in his booklet was this fantastic story of Jim the horse. So Jim the horse belonged to a neighbor of the Reverend, and he went missing one day. So everyone's out trying to find Jim, and they can't find him, and they begin to think, oh no, he's been stolen. When someone discovers him standing on the grounds of Center Church Cemetery, right near the tree where he would be tethered on Sundays, as usual for the service. So Brown wrote, quote, I don't know of a church in this whole community or in any other community that ever had a horse to which such a commendable performance can be credited. The other thing I found interesting while researching for this stroll was that center for the Center Presbyterian Church was sometimes spelled the British way, ending in R-E, and sometimes the American way, ending in E-R. Esther Baird wrote a very detailed history of the church for its sesquicentennial in 1978. In it, she related that the original spelling was the English spelling, the R-E. The two spellings, English and American, were then used interchangeably until the tenure of Reverend Ross Haverfield, who was pastor of the church from 1946 to 1951, and he made the ER spelling official. So in 1851, a new church building was constructed south of the original building on higher ground. It was constructed of locally fired bricks and cost $2,000. It was originally heated by 4 stoves, later replaced by 2 furnaces. And what I find interesting is that a full basement wasn't added to the church until 1925 when they dug in underneath it. The new basement provided a kitchen, a dining room, and space for social activities. And prior to that 1925 basement, social activities were always held in members' houses. The 1851 building still stands today, and you can make it out. It begins just to the left of the white doors with the stairs leading up to it, not all the way to the end of the building, but kind of just before that downspout. And then the 1, 2, 3, 4 first stained glass windows were also part of that 1851 building. The last one was not. A church choir was organized in 1856, and an organ was installed in 1872. You can see by looking at the building that as the population of the church and its needs changed, different additions were added on to the original building. As you can see from the plaque on the gatepost, Center Cemetery was founded in 1828, the same year that the Presbytery of Ohio granted permission for the establishment of the church. According to findagrave.com, there are 588 graves in Center Cemetery, but I will tell you that that is an underestimation. When I was preparing for this tour, I took pictures of lots of gravestones. I then attempted to look up on Find a Grave, and they have not yet appeared on there. Again, Find a Grave is like Wikipedia. It's a crowdsourced resource, and so it doesn't always have a complete record of everybody here. The cemetery is divided into sections, which are then divided into rows and then lots. So that's how you can identify any specific location in a cemetery. To the left of the gatepost is a sign erected by the George Washington chapter of the Pennsylvania Sons of the American Revolution. You'll find similar signs posted at cemeteries throughout Washington County. And that's because this chapter has worked very hard to identify all Revolutionary War soldiers buried in Washington County. They've actually compiled a publication listing all the names and locations, and they were kind enough to donate a copy of that to the library, and you can find it in our collection of local history books. You can see from this sign that there are 2 Revolutionary War soldiers buried in Center Church Cemetery, William Denniston and Jonathan McCarty. As we walk through the cemetery, you will see that there are many other veterans buried here. Their graves are marked by an American flag and include veterans of the Civil War, the War of 1812, World War I, World War II, and the Korean War. And although we're going to begin our tour today in the section over here to the right, it is actually this section here to the left that is the oldest part of the cemetery. And I think it's because it is behind the location of the original building. Therefore, it makes sense that the cemetery was established close to that structure. Daniel and Margaret Bell donated the land for the church and the cemetery. They are buried here along with their 7 children. The Bells were a prominent Peters Township farming family. Their son Solomon, however, who's also buried here with them, was an academic. He graduated from Jefferson College in Canonsburg in 1859. He then read and practiced law in both Allegheny and Washington counties before establishing the Stonewall Academy, quite close to Center Church, where he taught the classics to young men who were preparing to go to college. Solomon never married, and according to his 1902 obituary, quote, Mr. Bell was a member of the Presbyterian Church of Center and was held in high regard by all who knew him as an upright man. Unfortunately, Mr. Bell also suffered some serious physical injuries during his lifetime. According to the July 10, 1873 edition of the Washington Observer newspaper, while taking the afternoon train from Chartiers Road to Greer's Station, which was near his house, he was severely injured about the face when he was forced to jump from the train, which slacked up but failed to stop. The article went on to say that, quote, this should be a warning to others to avoid jumping off moving trains. Sadly, 8 years before his 1902 passing, Mr. Bell suffered another injury when he fell and fractured his hip, and so he wasn't able to walk for the last 8 years of his life. Rachel Ann Bell was a relative of the Roach family of Peters Township. She was born in Peters Township, grew up in Illinois, and then returned to the township in 1887 to keep house and care for her uncle, Robert Bell Sr., buried here beneath the stone marked Father. After her uncle's death in 1890, Bell then kept house for her cousin, Robert Bob Boyd Bell. Her uncle and cousin are both buried here beside Rachel, who outlived them both. And why I wanted to talk about Rachel for a minute is because the archives is lucky enough to have 2 of her diaries. The 2 together span the period 1889 to 1894. And the handwritten entries give us amazing insight into the life of a woman living in Peters Township in the late 19th century. Unfortunately, from the pages I have seen, it appears to have been a lot of churning, sewing, mending, cooking, and attending church. I honestly think that the break she got while attending church was probably the highlight of Rachel's life. What drew my attention to the Cooter graves seen here were the words wife of Harry S. Cooter that appear on the tombstone of Drusilla D. Having researched the history of Peters Township schools, I knew that Harry Sylvester Cooter, known as HS, was a veteran educator in Washington County. He graduated from Washington and Jefferson College in 1902 and then served as the first and only teacher of Peters Township High School from 1902 until 1913. If you lived in Peters Township and wanted to attend high school, prior to 1902, you had to go all the way to Canonsburg. Beginning in 1902, the school board leased a house from Hervey McMurray located on Valley Brook Road. So from 1902 to 1904, that's where classes were held. In 1904, the township built its first purpose-built high school consisting of 2 rooms divided by a folding wooden door on Bebout Road, just past the roundabout that we're all familiar with now. It has since turned into a private residence and is currently listed for sale. But it served as the high school for the township from 1904 until 1929, when the new brick high school was built across from the library where the intermediate unit is currently located. August and Mary, who are buried beside their daughter-in-law Drusilla, were Harry's parents. August was born in Germany and came to the United States when he was only 4 years old. His trade was a glassblower. Harry himself is actually not buried here with his first wife and parents, but in Oak Spring Cemetery in Canonsburg with his second wife, Florence. Ella May Kerr Heron died in 1911 at the age of 30. According to her obituary, she was ill only a few days, and the cause of her death was diabetes. Ella was survived by her husband Robert and 2 young sons, Boyd, age 6, and Arthur, age 14 months. Her husband went on to remarry and have 2 more children. He and his second wife, Susanna, are buried here to the left of Ella's grave. To Ella's right are 3 small stones. The first stone, closest to Ella's gravestone, if it ever had anything etched in it, it has been lost to time. The second reads, age 3 months, and the third reads, age 5 weeks. I'm unsure as to whether or not these are Ella and Robert's children, but regardless, their very existence is heart-wrenching. Alexander Blaine Brown was the son of the Reverend Matthew Brown and his wife Mary. His gravestone's design, as you can see, is very striking. This is what's known as a cradle or bed grave. The idea behind it being that the headstone served as the headboard and a smaller decorative footboard, and then sides, making it look somewhat like a bed. And then memorial flowers or plants were designed to be planted on top of the deceased. Cradle graves, despite the name, are not just for children. They are for people of any age. They were first seen in the United States in the early 1800s and then came to the height of their popularity during the Civil War, which makes sense in that Alexander died in 1863 in the middle of the Civil War. Alexander was a minister and a college president. He served as president of Jefferson College in Canonsburg from 1847 until 1856, and as pastor at Center Presbyterian Church twice, once from 1841 till 1845, and then again following his stint as a college president from 1856 to 1862. According to Find a Grave, Alexander's parents, the Reverend Matthew Brown and Mary, are also both buried here, but they have no grave marker. His father, the Reverend Matthew Brown Jr., was born in 1776 and graduated from Dickinson College in Carlisle, PA. He served both as president of Washington College in Washington, PA, and later as president of Jefferson College in Canonsburg. I don't know how many of you know that Jefferson College and Washington College were 2 separate colleges, Jefferson College in Canonsburg and Washington College in Washington, PA, currently united and known as Washington and Jefferson College. So they existed separately until following the Civil War, when due to a shortage of both funds and students, they decided to unite as a single university. But even after unifying in 1865, the 2 schools maintained separate campuses until the closing of the Canonsburg campus in 1869. A group of Canonsburg residents and Jefferson College supporters challenged the closing of the campus, and the case went all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States, which ruled in 1871 that the consolidation and closing were appropriate. Alexander Blaine Brown Jr., who I referenced earlier as being the author of that little booklet of the church's history for its 100th anniversary in 1928, is buried here. It's interesting to note that he died in 1931, only 3 years after he wrote that highly detailed and entertaining history book in 1928. So I think it's fair to say that the Reverend Alexander Blaine Brown Jr. was sharp as a tack until the very end of his life. And just in case you were thinking that there aren't enough Alexander Blaine Brown Jr.'s in Center Church Cemetery, I will tell you that Alexander's older brother Henry and his wife Ella named their only child, you guessed it, Alexander Blaine Brown. He too is buried here in Center Church a few rows down. Ada M. Bell died in her late 30s in 1896. She left behind children, John Neal Bell, and 5 children, the oldest of whom was only 12 at the time of her death. Her obituary described her as, quote, a good wife, a fond and affectionate mother who was held in high estimation by those who knew her. John married again, and he and his second wife, Sarah Jane Bell, are also buried here in Center Cemetery, immediately to Ada's right. John served as senior elder of the Center Church congregation for 35 years. John Anderson Baird and his wife Tefronia, known as Teffy, had 7 children in the 11 years between 1892 and 1903. Sadly, only 4 of the children, John, George, Sarah, and Esther, lived into adulthood. John and Teffy's daughter Ada died from influenza at the age of 14. Their youngest child, William, died from tuberculosis at the age of 7. An infant son, Baird, born in 1900, did not live long enough to be given a name. To put those childhood deaths in context, it helps to know that in 1900, 30% of all deaths in the United States occurred in children under the age of 5. By 1999, childhood deaths accounted for only 1.4% of all deaths in the United States. And this really is owing to a century's worth of improvements in medical care, technology, living standards, and public health. Happily, 2 of John and Teffy's children, John and Esther, lived well into their 90s. This stone is a memorial erected by Thomas Baird in memory of his grandparents, James Anderson, who passed away in 1824, and his wife, who died in 1805, both before Center Cemetery was established. The couple is not actually buried here. Their stone informs us that they, quote, are interred on the family farm in Peters Township. I asked my very experienced volunteer, very good at genealogy, Chris, if she could give Mrs. Anderson her name back. She did some research and learned that Sarah Jane Crane was the wife of James Anderson. She also discovered that the farm of the Andersons was located along Route 19, just south of where the Dodge Chrysler dealership currently is. According to Ancestry.com, James and Sarah's graves were located in the orchard of their farm near the fence along the road. The site was originally marked by 2 boulders and a half circle of juniper trees. James and Sarah Anderson's grandson, Thomas Baird, the one who erected the memorial in his grandparents' honor, is buried here with his wife, Martha. The couple had 12 children together. Their first child, Lizzie, was born in 1851 when Martha was only 18. Their last child, George, was born in 1878 when Martha was 45. So the age difference between Martha and her eldest child, 18 years, is less than the difference in age between her oldest child and her youngest child, a span of 27 years. I wanted to talk about both the iconography on Lorenzo J. Gillespie's striking gravestone and a little bit about the life of Lorenzo himself. In terms of the iconography or artwork, the arch symbolizes the soul's entry into heaven, the columns symbolize strength, and the lilies are a Victorian symbol of mourning. Thomas and Martha, that I just discussed, their 6th child out of 12, married Lorenzo at the Baird family home on September 5th, 1888. They were married by Center Church's Reverend Alexander Blaine Brown Jr. The connections amongst people in the cemetery is amazing. The Canonsburg Weekly Notes newspaper, for which Lorenzo had worked as a correspondent at Lawrence, wished the couple, quote, a long, happy, and prosperous journey along life's pathway. Unfortunately, that wish was never realized. Lorenzo died in 1894, only 6 years after the couple's wedding. Carrie married again and died in 1912 at the age of 49. She is buried in Mountain View Cemetery in Fresno, California. The Reverend Ezra Shive Heaney served as the pastor of Center Church from 1872 until 1878. Both he and his wife Esther are buried here. The Reverend has an interesting history. He was born in Bucks County, Pennsylvania in 1839 and graduated from Lafayette College in Easton, PA as a member of the class of 1867. While still at Lafayette as a student, Heaney answered President Lincoln's call for more volunteers to serve a 9-month term. He enlisted as a member of the 135th Pennsylvania Volunteers. Unfortunately for Heaney, he was taken prisoner at the Battle of Chancellorsville in 1863 and wasn't paroled until the end of the war in 1865. Some of you may know that the Battle of Chancellorsville is famous for being the battle in which Confederate General Thomas Stonewall Jackson was mortally wounded. After serving as minister at Center Church, the Reverend Heaney also served as a minister of the Finleyville and Mingo churches. At the time of his death in 1900, at the age of 60, he left behind a wife and 5 sons. So in speaking about the ministers who served here at Center Church, I think it's interesting to note that of the 17 ministers that served from 1830, when the Reverend John Kennedy was first appointed, until the arrival of the Reverend Joe Rogers in 1951, the church had 17 ministers. Of those 17, 4 are buried here at Center Church Cemetery. They are Alexander Blaine Brown Sr. and Jr., Reverend Heaney, and Reverend Joe Rogers himself. More on Reverend Joe in a bit. I just wanted to pause here for a moment at the gravestone of spouses Jane and Thomas Fife. You'll notice that they're decorated with 3 oak leaves and an acorn, a symbol of strength and longevity, the mighty oak. As Thomas lived to the age of 84 and Jane to the age of 79, I would say that it was an appropriate choice. William Hill of Hill Station died at the age of 100 on February 5th, 1895. Can you imagine living to the age of 100 back in 1895? Sadly, his death followed a fall on ice that resulted in some broken ribs, and I learned that fact from the local newspaper. It is amazing what local newspapers would report back in the day: who was admitted to hospital, who was released from hospital, who was visiting whom in what town, things that would today be considered personal information and never shared in a newspaper. Happily, Hill had the opportunity to celebrate his 100th birthday on November 14th, 1894, with 175 guests. Mr. Hill served as an elder of Center Church for 50 years. So before crossing the path and moving on to the second section of the cemetery, I wanted to take a moment to highlight something that struck me, and that was the high number of first and second wives buried near the husband that they shared in common. So here we have Maria Jane, known as Jenny Bebout Snodgrass, who died in 1886 at the age of 32. She's buried beside her husband, William Park Snodgrass, who outlived her by almost 30 years. Park, as he was known, married 13 years after Jenny's death. He married Clarabelle Atwood Craighead in 1898. Clara is buried here with her husband, as is their son Wilmer. Wilmer sadly passed away at the age of 9 in 1908, and I located a copy of his death certificate online. It's just heartbreaking. His occupation is listed as schoolboy, and he passed away from tuberculosis. On a separate note, I wanted to point out the tiny word blacks inscribed just in the corner of Jenny's gravestone. I wondered what that represented and did a little digging, and it turns out that Richard Black and his brother Robert Harry, who went by R.H., were partners in a marble and granite business in Canonsburg in the late 19th century. In 1890, their partnership was dissolved, but R.H. continued along in the same business until 1921. So Jenny's grave marker was manufactured and installed by the brothers Black. And I think it's just amazing how much history can be gotten out of 2 tombstones in a cemetery. You may notice that although Jenny passed away in 1886, her tombstone looks brand new. This is owing to the fact that the Center Cemetery Association picks several graves each year to be refurbished. this stone has been refurbished. Apparently a lot of the original stones were not built on any kind of foundation or with a gravel base or anything, which is why you will see them shifting and falling over and all of that. But as we go through the cemetery, there are several stones that are of quite an age that look almost new, and that's why. Here we have the very ornate gravestone of Thomas Denniston, who was born in 1792 and died in 1850. I was able to find a copy of his last will and testament online. In it, he instructs that he is to, quote, be buried in the graveyard at Center Church in Peters Township in the same range as my deceased father and mother. According to Find a Grave, Thomas's parents, William and Elizabeth, are buried here in Center Cemetery, but unlike their son, they have no grave markers. Thomas's will also stipulated that, quote, there be $600 of my estate appropriated to a monument over my grave and iron railings around the same. So I was curious as to how much $600 in 1850 would be equal to today, in today's dollars. So I went to a conversion calculator, and apparently $600 from 1850 would now be $25,000. I then wondered, did Thomas ever get his iron railings? And I figured I'd just never know, until I came across this great sketch of Center Presbyterian Church and Cemetery in Caldwell's Centennial Illustrated Atlas from 1876, in which you can see this very distinctive gravestone in the sketch, and around it, an iron-railed fence. I have no idea when it disappeared, but we at least know that it once existed. We now come to the story of the three Margarets Caldwell. Margaret Johnston Caldwell and Robert Caldwell married in 1865. It was a second marriage for both of them. Margaret had been married to John M. Bell until his death in 1858, and Robert had been married to Margaret Buchanan Caldwell, who passed away in 1853 at the age of 28 and is buried right here near her husband. So that's two Margarets, the first and second wives of Robert Caldwell. Robert and his first wife, Margaret, had a daughter, born in 1853, the same year her mother died. I don't have any details, but I don't think it's too much of a stretch to suppose that Margaret probably passed away from complications either during or after childbirth. Sadly, their daughter, whom they also named Margaret, passed away at the age of 2 in 1855. Her gravestone currently has an etching on the top that can't be made out. But happily, someone took a picture of it and uploaded it to Find a Grave when it could still be read, and it used to read, Margaret, daughter of Robert Caldwell. Robert and the second Mrs. Caldwell had a daughter, Mary Bell. Following her parents' death, she inherited their farm, Cedar Hill, on Old Washington Road. Mary then went on to marry Frank Morgan Roach, who was Center Church's Sabbath school superintendent for 15 years. There used to actually be a room in the church named after Frank Roach. Mary and Frank were the grandparents of Boyd Caldwell Roach Jr., who went by the name of Ike. And he was one of the original 20 Peters Township inhabitants who was interviewed in 2002, 2003 for the oral history of the township. And it was that project that kind of kicked off the entire growth of the local history collection here in Peters Township. William Reese Craighead, born on July 21st, 1828, was the first child baptized at Center Church. He was also the father of Clarabelle Craighead Snodgrass, whom we talked about a little bit ago as the second wife of Park Snodgrass. William Reese's baptism took place in August of 1829. He grew up to become a farmer who died in 1901 at the age of 72 from typhoid fever. I wasn't familiar with typhoid fever, so I looked it up, and according to the Mayo Clinic, it's a life-threatening systemic infection caused by a very specific strain of Salmonella and commonly contracted through contaminated food or water. It's now virtually eliminated in the United States and other high-income countries, but before that time, the mortality rate for typhoid was 10 to 20%. Agnes Jane Guthrie's gravestone reads, Agnes Jane, daughter of Robert and Ellen Guthrie, died March 17, 1870, aged 2 years, 10 months, and 13 days. So here's an example of a cradle grave that was actually designed for a child. And I was struck by how small it is compared to the larger adult-sized cradle grave in which Alexander Blaine Brown is buried. So I was struck by the interesting iconography that appears on Flora and James Douglas's gravestone. I hadn't seen anything quite like it before. Apparently a cross with a crown on top, often called the cross and crown, is a Christian symbol that represents Christ's sovereignty over death, and the reward of heaven, symbolized by the crown, following earthly suffering, the cross. The birds seen on the other side of the stone symbolize the flight of the soul after death. Sadly, Flora died in 1891 at the age of 38 from typhoid fever. James went on to live another 40 years, dying at the age of 80 in 1929. Although they're not buried in the older section of the cemetery, I wanted to end today's tour with a discussion of the Reverend Joe Rogers and his wife Jessie. For no tour of Center Church Cemetery would be complete without mention of its longest serving minister. So the Reverend Joe and his wife arrived in Peters Township in 1951. Joe was to serve as the church's 17th minister. He served for 3 decades, retiring in 1980. Reverend Joe, as he was called, lived to the age of 103, and his wife Jessie to the age of 100. They raised 2 sons, Joe Jr. and John, here in Peters Township. And when I asked current and former parishioners to share memories of the Reverend Joe, they talked about his dry sense of humor, that he used to go door to door in the township with a flyer and speak with neighbors to try and attract new members to the church, and that he hosted services to which he invited all the couples he married over his 30-year tenure and all the children he had baptized. And apparently in both instances, the church was just overflowing with people. Thank you for joining me on this tour of Center Church Cemetery. I hope you learned something you didn't know before, and that the story of one of the people we talked about today will stay with you, and in that way, they won't be forgotten.